A very warm welcome. Thank you for joining us. You're watching Obi and Horn of Africa. This is our weekly production, Talk to Obn. Today, I'll be joining Thomas C. Mountain virtually for commentary and analysis on the conflict in the northern part of Ethiopia. Thomas C. Mountain is an independent journalist, historian, researcher, political analyst, and educator. Thomas C. Mountain, thank you for joining me.
It's been an honor to be on your show.
Appreciate it. Okay, recently you appeared on Black Agenda Radio, and you forwarded your remark about ongoing conflict in Ethiopia. In quotation, you have said the conflicts in the north is architected by CIA, and TPLF is a proxy to the CIA. CIA is warring against Ethiopia. Can you recite us that again?
Yes, well, there's no question that what we call the national security establishment in the United States, which the CIA is part of, is using the Tigre People's Liberation Front as a proxy to try to get regime change in Ethiopia, because the Horn of Africa is a politically strategic part of the world, and the United States has used Ethiopia in the past as its policeman on the beat to control the Horn of Africa, because all the trade between Europe and Asia passes through the Red Sea, through the Horn of Africa. Something like $800 billion a year of trade passes through the Red Sea. So, who controls the Red Sea pretty much controls the two major economies in the world, Europe and Asia. So, the U.S. has been determined to maintain their control of this part of the world, the Horn of Africa. So, when Abiy Ahmed came to power in 2008, that was sort of the beginning of the end for the United States control, because up until that point, they'd used the TPLF as their policemen on the beat in the region, like they used the TPLF to invade Somalia in 2006 to overthrow the Union of Islamic Courts that brought peace to Mogadishu for the first time in 15 years. So, the history of the TPLF goes, I say the TPLF is really just basically a CIA proxy, because Gail Smith, a senior member of the National Security Council, and at one time senior director of the National Security Council and special assistant to Barack Obama, recruited Meles Zenawi probably way back in 1980. At Meles Zenawi's funeral, she eulogized him, saying she'd been close friends with Meles Zenawi for over 30 years, and that was in 2012. So, Meles Zenawi in 1980 was a mid-level cadre school instructor, and within 3 years, he became head of the TPLF. Now, he was no war hero. As a matter of fact, he was a notorious coward. He'd been disciplined twice for refusing to show up at the front and fight. So how did he become head of the TPLF in 3 years? Well, it was a campaign of assassination and bribery with CIA using USAID monies. So Meles was pretty much an agent for the CIA up until his passing in 2012. And, he basically, with his clique, including Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, looted and plundered the Ethiopian economy for 27 years. So, left Ethiopia pretty much as an aid-dependent nation with famine and starvation and all kinds of major problems, because they stole all the aid money. So, when how it came to be that Abiy Ahmed came to power is very interesting, because at that time it was President Trump was in power in the United States, and Rex Tillerson, who was an oil executive who knew nothing about Africa, was the Secretary of State, and he left things pretty much in the hands of a kind of a very weak, incompetent bureaucrat named Donald Yamamoto, who, when Rex Tillerson was fired by Donald Trump when he was leaving Addis Ababa on the airplane, and Trump replaced him eventually by Mike Pompeo, who then was the head of the CIA, came in as head of the State Department. So there was a period of chaos there, and the regime, what I call the Ethiopia's peaceful revolution, took place, and Abiy Ahmed came to power as prime minister. Now, it took Abiy Ahmed a while to really consolidate his power, but he was able to do so. And by the end of 2019, well into 2020, he'd forced the TPLF to retreat back to their homeland of Tigray. And then, but the reality was that the Ethiopian army historically had been completely dominated by the TPLF. That 85% of their fighters were Tigrayans, and 95% of their leadership were TPLF cadre. So when the TPLF pulled out of the Ethiopian army was pretty much just a shell of itself. And so the United States, in the end of 2020, decided that the time was right for the TPLF to launch a coup attempt to seize power in Ethiopia again. So this took place on November 4th, 2020, which was a U.S. election day, coincidentally. And the TPLF tried to seize the largest arms depot in Ethiopia, which is in Tigray. Well, they didn't succeed. The Ethiopian military stood up to them and beat off the attack. A lot of Ethiopian soldiers were killed or even massacred by the TPLF, but TPLF didn't succeed in capturing the arms depot. And 3 days later, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and 3 of his most trusted generals flew to Asmara, Eritrea, and asked President Isaias Afwerki for his support in this war. So I was in Asmara at the time, and my wife's in Eritrea ex-fighter, and we were hearing stories about our friends and relatives' children going to Tigray in the mechanized divisions. So the Eritrean mechanized division, so it's a very powerful, very well led by battle-hardened, experienced leadership, crossed the border into Tigray shortly after Abiy Ahmed visited Isaias and proceeded to help the Ethiopian army crush the TPLF army. And the TPLF admitted themselves that they lost 50,000 of their best fighters in this Eritrean and Ethiopian army offensive. The problem was when the TPLF basically were crushed, their leadership sent about 100,000. They had about 150,000 troops under arms. 50,000 were destroyed in the war, but about 100,000 were told by their leadership to take their Kalashnikovs and take off their uniforms and go back to their homes and communities and carry out acts of destabilization against the Ethiopian government. And when it was clear to the TPLF that they were going to lose this war because Eritrea was intervening, they released about 100,000 hardened criminals from the prisons in Tigray. So there was a major problem. There was 100,000 Tigrayan soldiers on the loose and another 100,000 hardened criminals in the society, and things became very chaotic. Well, the Eritrean army quickly pulled out of Tigray and went back home to Eritrea and left things in control of the Ethiopian army, which was still very poorly trained and led. So, in a strategic disaster, Abiy Ahmed pulled out of Tigray. And this allowed the US, the CIA, to rearm and regroup. The TPLF were able to regroup. Thousands of tons of food aid were poured in to the country under the guise of humanitarian assistance, and they launched what we call the second offensive. And the second offensive basically attacked the Amhara and Afar areas and caused a tremendous amount of destruction and suffering. And Amhara and Afar militias rallied with the support of the Ethiopian military, which had serious internal problems. Abiy Ahmed spoke about personally going to the front and having 2 of the top generals arrested for espionage. And but they were able to hold off the TPLF and drive them back under Abiy Ahmed's personal leadership to the borders of Tigray, which again Abiy Ahmed stopped and didn't go in and finish them off. Again, another mistake, in my opinion. So this allowed the U.S., the CIA, once again, to bring in enormous amounts of food aid and over 1,000 trucks that the TPLF commandeered to use for their, what we call the third offensive, which is going on right now. So, the second offensive, according to the TPLF, they lost 350,000 soldiers. Now, these aren't just real soldiers. These are mainly youth or even child soldiers who had been conscripted forcibly by the TPLF through the use of food aid blackmail. I mean, the Tigray was dependent on food aid. I mean, something like 1.5 million to 2 million people survived just on UN handouts. So, using food aid, they forced the families to give at least one of their children to go to the war. And the TPLF was infamous for using human wave tactics to attack their enemies. I mean, in 1991, 2001, the first time I visited Eritrea, I had a chance to go out to where the front had been, and standing on a hill, I was looked off into the distance and saw waves, lines and lines of dead, desiccated, dried in the heat Ethiopian soldiers stretching off into the distance. The human waves that had just been shot down as they're attacking Eritrean trenches. So, they sent these conscript soldiers with just a minimum of training into slaughter in the second offensive. And according to them, the TPLF, they lost 350,000 soldiers. When Abiy Ahmed didn't go in and finish them off, they regrouped. Now they're saying that they, have 500,000 in their army. And they're sending waves on waves against the forces against them. Now, for an example, just how bad it was, there's a Australian doctor who's been working in Afar for 30 years, and she said there were so many dead Wayani soldiers in her town. It's just a small town, and that the Wayani had looted or destroyed all the heavy equipment. They had a major sanitation problem trying to bury these bodies. And this is just one town of many, many others. So, the second offensive was a disaster for the Tigrayan people. And now we have the third offensive, which was, all these thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of tons of food aid that the UN and USAID has been pouring in the Tigray has all been diverted using trucks that the international community turned over without very little protest to the TPLF to carry their soldiers to the front, to bring the food aid to the front. And there's been several heavy Antonov airlifts into Tigray from Sudan, bringing arms as well. Today, we're in a situation where we don't receive a lot of news from the front. Things are pretty quiet in the news front, but it's pretty clear that the TPLF is being defeated, and they're being driven steadily back, and a lot of their top leaders are being killed. I mean, we're hearing reports about bodies with their heads cut off, which is very similar to the first offensive, the first coup attempt in December 2020, because they don't want people to be able to identify their top leadership. So whether, maybe they're fighting among themselves, maybe these people are being killed, but the TPLF is pretty much on the run. Now, of course, they've got 500,000 fighters under arms, and even if they're not that well trained or led, that's a very formidable force. And of course, you don't rebuild a military in a year and a half or 2 years like the Ethiopians have had to do. So, the Fano militias are playing a major role in this fighting. And something that's not receiving a lot of publicity is that there is a Tigray opposition army called Demhet, who've been training. I mean, I used to run into them all the time in Asmara. They've been training in Eritrea for 20 years. The Eritreans armed and equipped them with captured Ethiopian army equipment and preparing them for this day. And I think 25 to 30,000 of them at least are in Tigray now, their home province, fighting against the TPLF. So the Fano, the Demhet, and the Ethiopian army together are destroying the TPLF.
On your interview with Black Agenda Radio, you've said again, TPLF is proxy to the CIA and architected by the CIA and the US government. Since the get-go, you've been watching and following political dynamics of TPLF in the Horn of Africa. You're an independent journalist serving in various parts of Africa. Recently, you've been to Eritrea. Of course, we've been hearing and noticing that the US government and the European Union are favoring TPLF one way or another. It's just a rumor. But as an independent journalist, what are your tangible evidences to claim TPLF as a proxy to CIA? Because is that a presumption? Are you speaking presumably, or you have tangible evidence at hand as a journalist?
Well, there's this infamous Zoom meeting that was leaked with a number of the top former diplomats, including Donald Yamamoto and Vicky Huddleston and other people who long time history in Ethiopia, talking with in a meeting on Zoom with a TPLF representative in the U.S. talking about regime, how they're going to go about overthrowing the Abiy Ahmed government in Ethiopia. So I mean, they got caught red-handed. And, you know, we have a lot of other evidence, just the fact that all this aid and trucks and everything's been turned over to them and all these other things. But when they caught them red-handed on this meeting, very difficult for them to deny it. I mean, you know, they just pretend like the meeting didn't happen and nobody heard about it, but it happened. And, you know, so, I mean, that was pretty much the icing on the cake. I mean, they could no longer pretend. All they could do is just ignore it, which is what they do. I mean, they deny it even though they're caught red-handed. So I don't think there's any doubt that, you know, that TPLF is, I mean, they held a meeting in Washington, D.C. with a number of their cadre where they openly talked about replacing the Abiy Ahmed government. Now, that's a violation of the U.S. law. You can't talk about violently overthrowing a foreign country leadership in the United States. And this was carried out openly in the United States, so it had to have the blessing of the national security establishment and the CIA in the U.S.
You've said TPLF is a handyman of the U.S. government, CIA, and other European nations. For instance, during day one, starting from day one, from the get-go, people like Gala Smith, a very strong ally to Mala Zenawi. She has been serving as a USAID General Director. In the meantime, these days we're noticing people like Samantha Power, the same thing with the same caliber. That lady used to help them during their infant age. Now the same thing is happening. How do you put this in comparison? And your thought, please.
Well, you know, the way the propaganda campaign to try to make this look like genocide in Tigre was launched the very day the coup attempt was launched on November 4th. I mean, that was no coincidence. This is a propaganda campaign that was being, you know, directed from behind the scenes by the CIA, by the top leadership of the U.S. national security establishment. They didn't take 2 or 3 days to get started. It got started immediately the day the coup was launched. So that shows you that this is all being coordinated behind the scenes by some very nasty players. And, you know, the CIA has got a manual about how to overthrow governments and replace them with compliant regimes. And there's a lot of similarities between what's going on in Ukraine right now and what's going on in Ethiopia. I mean, I wrote an article about way back in 2003 about saying, you know, there are Afro-Nazis in Ethiopia, the TPLF. And just like in Ukraine, there's these Nazi parties. And this claim to ethnic superiority that based on Aksumite heritage that the TPLF constantly makes is very similar to what the Ukrainians are saying. So there are, and both counter-revolutions, you could call them, are, you know, basically direct. So the TPLF is just, you know, because of the strategically critical nature of the Horn of Africa, the U.S. has been sticking with them, even though, you know, it's a sinking ship. And now it seems like, I mean, the reports that Mike Hammer wouldn't even meet with the TPLF ambassador and other people that went to the UN General Assembly because he realized they're going to have to cut their losses. But what I'm predicting is they're basically realized TPLF is being destroyed. So what they're going to do is they're going to carry out a campaign of destabilization and sanctions against Ethiopia to try to make the Ethiopian people suffer, and to try to bring Ethiopia to its knees and to kneel down and to, you know, to say to the United States, okay, we've had enough. We'll let you call the shots. You know, yes, master, you're the boss. Well, I don't think Ethiopian people are going to accept that. And so, you know, I think the U.S. is going to carry out a very vicious campaign against Ethiopia, and it's going to cause a lot of pain. And unfortunately, because, you know, I lived in Eritrea for 15 years, from 2006 to 2021. And I was there during this UN sanctions against Eritrea, and I saw how much damage it did. And, you know, but Eritrea, the people pay outside the diaspora, pay 2% of their income tax. And this brings in hundreds of millions of dollars to the Eritrean government, which is critical to the survival of the country. Well, if Ethiopians outside would pay 2%, they wouldn't need the IMF, the World Bank, or any international aid. They could rebuild their country with direct support from their own people. But the history of corruption in Ethiopia makes it very difficult to convince the people, if they send their money, is it going to go to where it's supposed to, or is it going to get stolen? And I know from what I hear, there's still corruption problems in Ethiopia. So, but in the long run, if the Ethiopian people will rally behind their country and contribute 2%, they'll make their country independent and rich and prosperous without having to depend on any foreigners to do so. So, but that's the sort of the dream in the future. But for right now, it's going to be some tough times ahead for the Ethiopian people, because the U.S. is going to come with both feet down on Ethiopia to try to destabilize and destroy the economy there. And because of all the years of neocolonialism under the TPLF, Ethiopia became an aid-dependent country.
Okay.
And the aid being stolen, tens of billions of dollars stolen by the TPLF, sent outside to City of London banks. And so Ethiopia is aid dependent. So it's going to be very, very difficult to break that. Now, of course, big strides are being made in food security, because food security is national security. And Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is, led a big push for massive wheat planting so they have enough food. And, he's talking about even maybe being able to export grain. So, that's a first big step, because Ethiopia needs to be food secure. But the second thing is you need investment, and where it's going to come from is a problem. But if you can get it from your own people, that's always the best.
For how long would the U.S. government favor TPLF, though the TPLF is a worn-out entity in Ethiopian political dynamics? From the day one up until today, TPLF is being backed by the U.S. and other superpowers. Such commentaries are coming from different scholars, including yourself. For how long would it, with this caliber? TPLF is on the verge of extinction. What
Yes.
U.S. second plan, though, now?
Well, I think that's why Hammer, if it's true, the reports are true, Hammer is cutting ties with the TPLF, refusing to meet with them, because they're about wiped out. And it's going to take a while. And then, of course, you have remnants in the countryside. They're going to destabilize the country. And then you've got this tens of thousands of Shifta that are still been released from prison. So there's an enormous job ahead for Ethiopia to clean Tigray. But once the cancer has been excised, been cut out of the body, then, the healing can begin. And Ethiopian people can begin to sleep peacefully at night. So I think the TPLF is, by the end of the year, I think all of their cadre will be in prison or gone, exiled or dead. And most of their cadre have been hunted down. And hopefully this will be done without a lot of reprisals taken against them by the, by the Fano and other people that representing people that have been severely brutalized by the TPLF. But, maybe in a few weeks, I think the military end of it should be wrapping up. But it may take a little longer than that, because, of course, you're talking about 500,000 men under arms when this all started. So you don't wipe out an army of 500,000 in a short time. But one thing is clear: the Tigrayan people, I think, are pretty fed up with the TPLF. I mean, Eritrea has had to open a refugee camp in Shambuko and Gashbarka because so many thousands and thousands of Tigrayans are fleeing Tigray. And we've heard all these lies from people that are supposedly scholars about Ethiopia, supporting articles in New York Times claiming that Eritrea troops committed atrocities in Tigray. Well, why would the Tigrayan people go to Eritrea if the Eritreans had been committing atrocities against them? No, they're telling the truth with their feet. They know Eritreans are their friends and they're safe in Eritrea. So they're going to Eritrea to take refuge while this war is going on. So that puts a lie to all these claims of Eritrean brutality and crimes in Tigray. The Eritrean people, we heard these reports when I was still in Eritrea, and we actually talked to Eritrean fighters who'd been in Tigray during the war, and they just were like, this all lies. That doesn't happen. That's against our moral principles. The Eritrean people, we don't rape and pillage and murder people. The Eritrean army is very disciplined, and the people, they have no desire to take revenge against the Tigrayans. They just want to see the end of the TPLF, which is why Eritrean blood was shed in Tigray in December of 2020 to do. So, you know, again, how long the war is going to last, it's difficult to say. I don't have any direct lines into the top military command, but, you know, all the signs seem to be pointing to a increasingly desperate TPLF. I mean, you see less and less interviews with Debrecen and Getachew Reda and those guys. So I think because they're hiding out. I mean, there's drones hunting them, and you know, of course, this happened back in December 2020 when the TPLF lost about 90% of their top cadre after Mekele was, you know, fell. And but you know, so I call this TPLF 2 because most of TPLF 1 were wiped out 2 years ago. So TPLF 2 now, the second string, you know, these are different people, and they're still in power. And how long it's going to take to finish them off, I haven't got a crystal ball, but all signs see that it looks like they're going to be done. Maybe in a few weeks, maybe in a few months.
Okay, many critics are saying that international organizations such as World Food Program, USAID, UN, and others are favoring TPLF. And recently, TPLF army looted fuel from World Food Program warehouse. But those USAID and World Food Program authorities try to condemn and denounce TPLF. Some people said it's, as the saying goes, it's like a slap on the wrist. Do you agree, though?
Of course. I mean, you know, they were turning up. It wasn't just turning a blind eye. They gave the okay behind the scenes for TPLF to keep all these over 1,000 heavy trucks that they sent inside, and all this aid that was going there. They knew it wasn't getting out to the Tigrayan people. They knew it was going to the front to feed the TPLF army. So, you know, to conveniently have 500,000 liters of fuel where the TPLF could get at it easily without any problem, basically unguarded, was you know, no coincidence. This was part of the plan, you know, for the third offensive, you know, the last try to overthrow the Abiy Ahmed government and to reinstall the TPLF as the U.S. policeman on the beat in the Horn of Africa. So there's a long history. I mean, way back in when the TPLF was invading Eritrea in 2000, June 2000, all these World Food Program trucks, there was a major drought at the time. All these hundreds and hundreds of World Food Program trucks were turned over with the keys in them and full tanks of fuel to the TPLF army to use to transport their troops to invade Eritrea. So I mean, this is a long history. I mean, when the TPLF was carrying out the genocide in the Ogaden, when they put a food and medical aid blockade on the Somali people in the Ogaden from 2006 to 2018, the World Food Program and USAID was turning over thousands of tons of grain to the Leo police, the death squads that the TPLF was using to suppress the Ogadeni uprising. So this is mainly Western aid providers supporting the TPLF. You know, I mean, going way back to 1973, 74, when there's Michael Jackson and We Are the World, and they raised $100 million or maybe more. Some estimates, several hundred million were turned over in cash to the TPLF, supposedly to feed starving people in Tigre. And of course, half the people suffered from famine or Eritreans, and they never got any of it. And according to what I call a liar for hire, a guy named Martin Plaut, who was at the head of the BBC Africa desk at the time, the TPLF basically stole that money, and only about 5% went to buy food aid. And they claim Martin Plaut had to come up with an explanation of why, where that money went to, because otherwise people start asking questions. So he claims it went to arms, which is a complete fabrication, because I know people that lived in Sudan at the time, and there was no way $100 million or more worth of arms was going across the border. That money was all stolen by Meles Zenawi and put in his bank accounts in the City of London banks with the help of Gail Smith from the CIA. So, you know, they've been stealing aid and using it for their own reasons for going back to before they were in power. And, you know, when they fought against Eritrea, they were using World Food Program and USAID food to feed their army that invaded Eritrea, and the trucks that, you know, transport their troops and the aid. You know, they used this aid against the people of the Ogaden when they're carrying out the genocide there. And now, you know, they've been using this from the get-go starting from 2020, December 2020, when they were, before that, when all this aid that was pouring in was being used to, get the TPLF army ready to pull their coup off. Of course, the CIA thought the coup was going to be pretty easy because they thought there was no Ethiopian army. And they didn't realize that Abiy Ahmed was going to get Eritrean support. And when they did, well, then it turned into a long, drawn-out war. So, but aid agencies are nefarious. The World Bank and the IMF are two of the main ways the Western United States uses to control Africa by making their African economies aid dependent. The IMF policy is not allow a country to become food self-sufficient. They want everything to be export to the Western markets so that they can make a lot of profit. And they don't want Africans feeding themselves. Then they want Africans on your knees, hungry and starving and begging for help. So, the aid is a trap. And that's why Eritrea, right from the get-go, Eritrea would never accept IMF or World Bank money, because they know this was a trap to make you economically dependent on the Western countries. And Eritrea pretty much expelled all the, what I call the no good outfits, the NGOs, out of their country, because Eritrea wants to be self-sufficient. And, when Abiy Ahmed came to power and he came to visit Asmara, we were there and he was speaking openly that we want to be like Eritrea. We want to be independent. We want to be food self-sufficient. So, the aid agencies are not there to make you food self-sufficient. They're to make you there to be beggars. I wrote an article about Angel of Mercy or Angel of Death in Somali, how the World Food Program and the USAID came into Somalia way back in their, almost 15 or 20 years ago and handed out, thousands of tons of free food aid right as the Somali farmers were bringing their food to the market. And basically they couldn't sell their food. So they bankrupted the farmers and made it difficult for them to continue, growing food, and made Somalia even more aid dependent. So, that's the trap that they're trying to drag you into.
An independent journalist, educator, researcher, storyteller, political analyst, Thomas C. Mountain, thank you for joining me from Lynchburg, Virginia, to give me this commentary and analysis on the ongoing conflict in the North and TPLF's profile vividly. I would like to say thank you very much on behalf of our media house.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's an honor being here, and hopefully you'll have me back. Maybe we can talk about Oromo history, which is something, I'm a historian, right?
Okay, awesome. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Viewers, thank you for joining us and thank you for being with us. This brings you the end of our edition for today. Thank you. Bye-bye.